In fact, it occurred to me this past week that in the 11 Advent and Christmas seasons that I've shared with you here at Knox, I have never preached on or even heard a sermon about Zechariah and Elizabeth. I couldn't figure out why until I did a bit of digging. Turns out that short of a nod to the interaction between the two cousins, Elizabeth and Mary, the story is never mentioned actually in any lectionary. Until now. This last Sunday before Christmas in the narrative lectionary. Finally. So now that I've spent some focused time with them, let me go on record saying that I really think that Zach and Liz get a raw deal from the church. Oh, Helen? Thanks. I think that their story is the real doorway to Advent, the OG harbingers of the season. Let me back up all these audacious claims. The various events that make up what we collectively call the Christmas story occurred during a very, very dark time for the Jewish people. It had been roughly 400 years since God had last spoken to his people through a prophet, and that prophet was Malachi. Israel had been through centuries of wars, captivity, exile, and domination by foreign rulers. So the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Seleucids, and now was under the occupation and oppression of Rome. The world had been growing darker and darker by the year. God's silence was deafening. Life seemed devoid of hope, peace, joy, and love. Darkness overshadowed them. The author of the Gospel of Luke, a doctor and a bit of a historian, is the only one of the gospel writers to set this scene. Mark doesn't mention any of it. Matthew begins with a genealogy, and John makes this strange theological statement and then launches into the story, and by that point, everyone's an adult. But Luke really, really takes the time to set the scene. He does not mess around. There is no icing on this cake. In the days of King Herod of Judea, there was a priest named Zechariah who belonged to the priestly order. His wife was a descendant of Aaron also. Her name was Elizabeth. Both of them were righteous before God, but they had no children, and they were getting on in years. In the days of King Herod. Herod was a tyrant, an absolute tyrant. Never mind his family issues, having murdered his father-in-law, several of his wives, and at least 2 of his own children. He was an unstable individual with unchecked insecurities, paranoia, jealousy, and more money than brains. Isn't it nice to know that we don't have these kind of rulers in our world today? Whew. Thank goodness. In the time of this berserk monarch, there was a priest called Zechariah and his wife, who was also descendant of the priestly caste. So in the midst of all this political turmoil around them and their people, Zach and Liz kept their heads down. They played their part. They lived goodly, godly lives. They followed the law of Moses. They served at temple. They probably lived with great compassion and commitment to orphans and widows and foreigners. They were righteous before God and before people. Nevertheless, they were childless. And while we have come a long way in recognizing that a couple's worth, a woman's worth, is no longer tied to their ability to procreate, 2,000 years ago, it was not looked upon quite so generously. It was a curse and socially insecure to be childless. In the time of King Herod lived a righteous priestly couple, but they were barren, and now they were well into their senior years. This story couldn't have a bleaker beginning if you tried. Of the 4 Gospels, only Luke begins with the story of Zechariah and Elizabeth, the story of a couple getting on in years, any hope of having children all but gone, hopelessness taking root. But then comes this incredible promise of a child to be born to them. To them! This is, of course, a physical impossibility. There are doctors in the house today who could confirm this. Life out of death, a miracle. Now listen, church. If this plot sounds familiar, it should, because it's painstakingly similar to the story of Abraham and Sarah, their story in Genesis. Do you remember them? Talked about them back in September. I mention them every so often. When for the first time ever in all of creation, God seeks out and chooses a couple, enters into a pact, a promise, a covenant with them. I will be your God. You will be my people. I'm going to give you land. I'm going to bless you so you can be a blessing to all the nations. Oh, and kids. I'm going to give you scads of kids, descendants like you've never seen, more than grains of sand on the beach or stars in the sky. Now that was a rather wild promise, given that Abraham and Sarah were already well on in years. But this is how Luke starts his gospel, by reminding of us of an earlier beginning, the beginning of God's relationship with God's people Israel, a story that began not with Zechariah and Elizabeth, not with Mary and Joseph, but began when God called Abraham and Sarah, who left their homeland and their people to follow God into an unknown future. From the outset, the biblical story is one of God choosing unlikely, some might even say undeserving candidates, and unexpected ways, miraculous ways, to accomplish God's purposes, to bless the world, to communicate God's love to the world, to redeem the world to God's self. This has been God's modus operandi from the beginning. That's what Luke is reminding his readers of. Now, Abraham and Sarah, they laughed when they first heard the promise that they would have a son. With Sarah 90 years old and Abraham nearly 100, the promise seemed utterly absurd, insane. They had long before given up hope of having children of their own, yet despite Abraham and Sarah's skepticism and their attempts to take matters into their own hands, God's promise proves true. Sarah does conceive in her old age and gives birth to a son who is called Isaac. One person whispered it. This just means we have to do the narrative lectionary again next year. Until I can basically have a fill-in-the-blank sermon and you get all the, we're just going to keep cycling. We're just going to keep doing it. They give birth to a son whose name is Isaac, which in Hebrew means laughter. Sarah exclaims, God has brought laughter for me, and everyone who hears will laugh with me. Sometimes we all just have to have a laugh at the absurdity, the enormity, and the grace of it all. Let's go back to Luke's gospel now. And since we know that first things really matter in biblical accounts, let me tell you the meaning of a few other names. Besides Herod, whose name is dropped to set the scene for the gospel, the first name to be mentioned in Luke's gospel is Zechariah, whose name literally translates to mean God remembers. God remembers. The second name mentioned is Elizabeth, which means God is my oath. That's how Luke's gospel starts. In the time of the tyrant, King Herod, lived a priestly couple, God remembers and God is my oath. They were faithful and they were righteous, but they were also barren. The womb was a tomb. There was no life there, just like Abraham and Sarah. The penny ought to be dropping right about now for anyone, really. Luke's weaving together of Old and New Testaments is incredibly obvious. We meet Zechariah as he and his division of priests faithfully fulfilled their annual duties at the Jerusalem temple. One of the more noble tasks the priests performed during their service was the burning of the incense twice a day inside the holy place. Burning incense was a ritual, a symbolic act that represented lifting the prayers of the faithful up to heaven, hopefully to the ears of God. Many religions, even some Christians, still practice burning incense during the worship service. So if you're ever wondering why, there you have it. Use that in Trivial Pursuit later. When Zach's name was drawn from the hat, he prepared himself for his noble and sacred task, and then he went in. He was not, however, expecting an angel to show up. Do we ever really expect angels? I think we usually find them suspect at least, scary at worst. The angel Gabriel appears to him to announce that Elizabeth will conceive and bear a son, and they're to name the child John. John will bring them joy and gladness. He will be filled with the Holy Spirit and set apart for a special purpose, to prepare the way of the Lord, and to make ready a people prepared for the Lord. A throwback now to the prophecy, the prophet Malachi, the last prophet through whom God spoke to the people of Israel. God remembers. God is our oath. Now, Zach, like all of us, is human, perhaps to a fault. Like Abraham and Sarah before him, Zechariah is skeptical when he hears the promise of a child. If angels are suspect, then good news is often flat out unbelievable, inconceivable. How shall I know this is so? He asks the heavenly messenger, for I am an old man and my wife is getting on in years. Now, for whatever reason, this pragmatic question that Zach asks gets greatly chastised, and Gabriel renders him mute for the next 9 months. It was a fair question, so I'm not quite sure why the consequence was so severe. In fact, as a side note, just a few months later, Gabriel brings a holy pregnancy announcement to a young woman in Nazareth who also finds the whole thing quite unbelievable. Yet by then, Gabriel has managed to cool his jets because she doesn't end up mute for her whole pregnancy. Whatever that's about. Another sermon, perhaps, on Gabriel's anger management issues. Or perhaps something about turning down the voices of powerful old men so that the voice of a young girl can be heard echoing across the eons. Again, I digress. Seems I just can't help myself. Preach, preacher. Anyway, speechless, Zechariah goes home to his wife Elizabeth, and soon after she conceives. God remembers, and God is my oath. They fall pregnant, and it is a miracle because it is life out of death. During the reign of King Herod, the tyrant, during Roman occupation, when God's voice has not been heard for 4 centuries. This is how Luke begins the gospel of good news. And when, after 9 months, their son is born, he is called John, which means God has been gracious. Are you putting the pieces together, church? First things matter. All of this precedes Luke's tale of the Annunciation to Mary. This is Advent. This story is Advent. Before the Immaculate Conception, before a long journey to Bethlehem to be registered for a census, before inns that are too full and mangers being retrofitted into cribs, before angel choirs and shepherds, before all of that is the story of a man God remembers, and his wife, God is my oath, and the miraculous birth of their son, God has been gracious. And if first things matter so much, consider Zechariah's first words after he gets his voice back. Blessed be the God of Israel, for God has looked favorably upon God's people and redeemed them. The people who made a covenant with God back in Genesis 12 through another elderly, childless couple. People who struggled to keep their end of the deal. People who experienced God's miraculous hand drawing them out of slavery in Egypt, through the wilderness and into the promised land. People who battled their own demons and tendencies towards idolatry. People whose kingdoms fell to empires over and over again and were now oppressed by Rome, living in the time of King Herod. Blessed be the God of Israel, croons Zechariah, for he has looked favorably upon his people and redeemed them. Zechariah recognizes that in the birth of their son John, God has looked with favor upon the whole people of Israel to fulfill the promises made long ago to their ancestors. God is bringing life out of death again. God has not forgotten. God is still our oath. God has been and continues to be gracious. This is Advent. And it leads into the story that we call Christmas. The story of God taking on flesh and bone and moving into the neighborhood beside us. God the Creator, now God the Messiah, taking root in the womb of a brave young woman in Nazareth. And the son of the one called God remembers, the babe of the womb of the one called God is my oath, shall go first, John the Baptist, to prepare the way of the Lord, to proclaim his arrival to the world. God has been gracious. He will prepare the way for the one who is called Emmanuel, God with us. If that's not Advent, I don't know what is. The entire story of God's covenant relationship with Israel, beginning with the promise to Abraham and Sarah, is coming to fulfillment in this story that Luke tells. This story that begins once again with a promise and a birth against all odds. Fulfillment has been a long time coming. Israel has been through wars and captivity and exile and domination by foreign rulers. And worse yet, it's now the time of King Herod. But remembering how God has proven faithful in the past, even when all hope seems lost, builds confidence that God can be trusted again in the present and the future. Let me say that again, church. Remembering how God has proven faithful in the past, even when all hope seems lost, builds confidence that God can be trusted in the present and the future. Even while Herod and Caesar and others rule with an iron fist, God's reign of justice and mercy is breaking into this world in the unlikely births of two infants in obscure villages, John the Baptist and then baby Jesus. This is the message of the season, and it still is today. Because sometimes we still feel like God has been silent for too long. And sometimes we still feel that perhaps the promises of a day when there will be no more war and no more tears, no more death, Maybe we feel like that promise has been forgotten. Maybe it was all just a pipe dream to begin with. There are times in our lives and in our life together as God's people when problems mount and it is difficult to see a way forward. When it seems as though all hope for the future has reached a dead end. When one foot no longer seems to be able to go in front of the other. But this is the good news. We are encountered again and again and again by a God who remembers, and a God for whom there are no dead ends. Detours, maybe, but not dead ends. There is no room for death here. The good news is story after story of encounters with a God who always works for good, even when we mess things up. A God who specializes in making a way in the wilderness, opening up a future when none seems possible, bringing life out of death. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. You've all had enough sugar anyway. Often we don't understand God's ways or God's timing. Often we are filled with doubt and we are tempted to despair. Yet our story of faith reminds us that God always proves faithful in the end. Our God always proves faithful in the end, turning despair into hope, doubt into faith, sorrow into laughter, and even sometimes rejoicing. God proves faithful by working in unexpected ways and through unlikely candidates, even such unlikely candidates as you and I. Despite our weaknesses, despite our doubts, despite our resistance, God works to create faith in us and to accomplish God's purposes. God remembers, and God always has been and always will be in the business of bringing life out of death and defeating darkness even with the smallest of lights, because God is love. Love. The most powerful force that exists. Hope and peace, joy and love. The candles we light each Advent season. Or faith, hope, and love, writes the Apostle Paul. But the greatest of these is love. And it is love that came down at Christmas. This whole story ought to sound familiar, folks. It's as old as time. It's God's story, it's our story. In actual fact, it is the only story, which is why we keep telling it year after year after year to our children and to each other, to ourselves, to the world. It's not about coming up with something new and crafty and clever to the relief of preachers everywhere. It's about telling that same story over and over and over again. Church, God remembers. God is our oath. God is gracious. God is with us. Emmanuel. And God is love. Come, Lord Jesus. To God be all the glory. Amen.